Miss Fortune.
Be right there, guys.
What? Stanley?
Yeah.
That's Stanley. That's Stanley.
You?
This is our montage.
Don't grab my hand. Miss Fortune, look
Yes,
it.
Miles. Ooh, look what you got.
Yeah, my mom got it for me.
Awesome. I didn't even know they made that one. We'll have to get that one for the classroom.
Well, I don't know what it was.
That's a good find. Hey, everybody.
That's a good find.
Hi.
Miles, you want to show what you found?
Cool. We don't have that one.
No, we do not have that one. We need to get
Who
that
is
for
that?
the classroom, definitely.
To Stanley? I never ever heard of it.
Miles, did you want to tell everybody who Stan Lee is?
He's the
For those
person
that might not know.
who created Marvel and made like a bunch of stuff, and he made most of the Marvel movies. He made every Marvel.
Alina,
Yeah?
he's in every Marvel movie.
And they're always funny appearances.
Yeah, like the janitor. When Captain America stole the suit, and then he said, "I am so fired."
That's good. That's good. It's always fun to wait for him to.
Oh,
You know he's going to show up. It's fun to watch for him.
in Captain America Civil War, so there was this FedEx driver and it was Stan Lee, and Captain America purposely made it to a Mr. Stark, but he called it Mr. Stank.
Oh.
And Stan Lee is like, "Are you Mr. Stank?" And everybody laughed.
That's a good one. Okay, Braden, I see that you found us. Okay, so just a reminder to everybody that these lessons are always found in Google Classroom. The Zoom links are there with the lesson. I think most of you use that method to get here. And I also, if it's something that the whole class is invited to, I also put it in the calendar. I can't put everything in the calendar because sometimes people end up clicking on things necessarily. Okay, it looks like everybody's here. They're coming. Ooh, oh, and that's a lot of Legos. What are you building, Owen? Oh my! Yeah, that is huge.
I also have that. I also built that. What the
Okay,
heck?
I definitely want to see a picture of that when it is done.
I built that too.
You have that too, Sam?
I do.
Very cool.
My brother wanted it.
I can't wait to see that one finished. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone. Welcome, good morning. It's a good day. Ooh, let me get Adam in here. It's a good day for us to discuss the Aztec civilization. Would you please just raise your hand if you have already looked at the presentation? I know at least one of you has because I received a report about the Aztecs this morning in my email. And it was very thorough. Thank you, Alina. Okay, many of you did look at it. Great. If you didn't, don't worry. Braden, did you look at it? Did you read the presentation before coming? Give me a sign, yes or no. Because I can only see your nose and one eye right now. Okay, thumbs up, great. All right, so let me go ahead and share my screen. Don't worry if you haven't looked at it yet, because we're gonna go through it together right now. But I think you get more out of the presentation if you have read it first. Okay, if you have a question, I have to get my screen ready so I can see you. Okay, if you have a question, I'm not able to see everybody's faces at the same time right now. So it would be helpful if you use the blue raise hand button to ask me your questions. Oh, Adam, it sounds like
Or
your
chat.
internet is wonky. Can you just leave and come? I'll let you back in. We'll try that, okay? I'm sorry. You can try to use the chat as well, but I have a lot of windows I'm managing here. So raise your hand if you have a question or type it in the chat, okay? All right, so before we get going here, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the pronunciation. We're talking about, again, another civilization in Mexico, right? Mexico and Central America. And there are a lot of names that we're going to be discussing in this presentation that have the letter X in them. For those of you that speak Spanish or have a Spanish speaking family member, you probably know that the Spanish language is very phonetic. And what I mean by that is it is basically spelled exactly the way that it sounds. And most of the letters do not have too many different sounds that they can make. It makes Spanish a lot different than English. In English, we have to learn a lot of different sounds for each of our letters, because depending on how they're combined or what part of the word they're in, they can have different sounds. Okay, I gotta mute some more folks here. Okay. Spanish is not this way. Most of the letters sound the same every single time, which makes it a pretty easy language to spell. But there are just a couple letters in Spanish that can have different sounds, and X is one of them. So when we say Mexico, that has a letter X in it. Most of the time, especially when it shows up between vowels or at the end of a word, the letter X in Spanish sounds like X, like KX, the same way that it does in English. But in the indigenous people's language, which that's who we're talking about, are the people that first settled in this area. Their language tended to use the letter X for a sh sound. So that leaves me with a little bit of a dilemma. When we're talking about these place names from a long, long time ago that were established by indigenous people, I feel like the right thing to do is to try to use the sh sound instead of the x sound. So I'm going to attempt to do that, but I will remind you that I am not a native Spanish speaker. I did take 7 years of Spanish, but I don't practice very often. So I'll do my best with these words. You can giggle at me. If you're a Spanish speaker out there, feel free to giggle. I don't mind, because I'm just going to try my best, okay? So the Aztecs begin with a lot of groups, individual groups that were settling all around this area in Mexico. And I'm trying to remember if we have a map. Why did that cause me to mute people? Okay. When we get to a map, we can talk a little bit more about it. We are talking about a conglomeration of many, many groups in this area in the central Mexico. Come on. Okay. There were some people living there called the Anahuac. And these people had been there a while. And when the newcomers arrived, they came from the north and they kind of made their way south. When they arrived, the Anahuac, who were already living there, were not impressed. They thought that they were, I think that what we would probably call them today is country bumpkins. They were not impressed with their clothing. They were not impressed with their language. The Anahuac felt like they were the cool ones, and these people coming down from the south that were called the Mexica or Mexica were not so cool. And so one thing though that they did find impressive about the Mexica were that they had some pretty good weapons and they looked pretty strong, and they thought, maybe we should align ourselves with these guys. I think that we could use their skills, their warrior skills. So these newcomers did not speak the Anahuac language, Nahuatl, but they did for a while get along really well, and they blended their communities pretty well. And so because these newcomers were called the Mexica, and a lot of things happened, but ultimately the land that we're talking about became known as Mexico after the Mexica. But let me quickly tell you about some of those things that happened. The Mexica developed a little community around on an island in a lake, and their community was pretty successful. And they grew, and they formed alliances with other communities, and they began to form an empire. So we're going to talk more about that in a minute. The Mexica were semi-nomadic when they arrived here. So we've talked a lot about what it means to be a nomad. Does anybody want to help describe what it is to be a nomad? I'm trying to see all of you. Thank you, Ada. Go for it.
It's one person who has no permanent home and just travels like from place to place.
Great. Goodness. Nana would like to answer the question. Okay. So a nomad is someone who has a completely temporary dwelling that they can pack up and travel to the next spot to find food. Sometimes they're following animals that they use for food. Sometimes they're following plants that are growing in other places that they're using for food. And they pack up, they move to the new place where the food is, they hang out there as long as it lasts, and then they pack up and they move to a different spot. And in places where the seasons really change and the weather really changes, they might be moving to a more hospitable environment during the winter, and then moving out to like a big grassy prairie is not a great place to spend the winter because it gets really windy there. But they might go there for the summer where they can hunt the animals that are living there. A semi-nomadic people, that means that they've taken one step toward settling down. And so they have created a base camp where they might grow a few crops, but then they also have temporary dwellings that they go out probably in the nicer seasons, the spring, summer, and fall. They go out and they live in a temporary dwelling for part of the year, hunting, gathering, what have you. But then they also have a base camp where they can return, and they might have some folks there that stay there and tend to some crops. So these folks were semi-nomadic at the time that they arrived in this place. Now, why did they come here? An Aztec legend says that the war god, now this is a tough one, Huitzilopochtli, promised the people that they would know their new homeland when they saw an eagle with a snake in its mouth sitting on a cactus. So they were traveling looking for this sign. And we don't know for sure if they found it. I think there are a lot of stories that say that they did. But today, this moment in their history is commemorated on the flag of Mexico. In the center of the Mexican flag, there is an image of a snake with of an eagle with a snake in its mouth. And that is a very symbolic of the Mexican people. There it is. So there's the cactus and the eagle with the snake. So they arrive at Lake Texcoco, and they have a little island in the middle of this lake. I'll get to you, Sama, in just a moment. And they called their new city Tenochtitlan. And they formed it on an island in this lake, Lake Texcoco. Now, this location was a good one in a lot of ways because there was water, it was easy to defend because it was an island. The lake also obviously provided them with fish and birds to hunt and evidently frogs to eat. Oh, thank you, Olivia. It really very much depends on where you do your research, is what I learned. The location, but of course, living on an island has its difficulties, right? You can't really create a farm easily on an island. And there wasn't any wood, there weren't any trees or stone for building, and flooding was also a bit of a problem. So it had its pros and its cons. So how did they solve these problems? They built what are called causeways. And these were land bridges that connected the capital to the mainland. And they also built earthen walls, walls made out of mud, to protect the city from floods. And they also did a lot of trading with the other people in the area to get the wood and the stone that they needed to build homes and palaces and temples. Yes, Sama.
I just forgot that Miss Rivera speaks Spanish.
She sure does. And you know what? I was wishing when I was getting ready for this presentation, do you know, I thought about her many times and wishing I could borrow her to help me out. And before I tell this story again in the classroom, I'm going to be checking with her because this is the neighborhood where she grew up. Yeah.
Really?
Okay. So to solve the problem of finding a place to farm, hold on, they built chinampas in their lake. These were islands that they built. They wove branches to make huge underwater baskets, and they planted trees around the baskets to help keep them in place. And then the baskets could be filled with mud from the bottom of the lake. And I bet that mud was full of nutrients that they dredged up from the bottom of the lake. So here you have the idea of the basket, the woven branches. Everybody okay? I heard a shriek. And those were the baskets that they filled with mud. And then the trees kind of acted like the trees that you see here around the perimeter. Have you ever put up a tent? The trees are acting a little bit like a tent stake to keep it in place. The trees would root down in the mud and hold the basket so it didn't move, and they could plant their plants on there. Now, was that incredible or what? How ingenious. That was a great way to solve that problem. And evidently it was very successful. They basically created these islands of farmland. And on these floating gardens, they grew corn and beans and peppers and avocados. So their success with farming really contributed to the success of the city of Tenochtitlan. And by the 1400s, they had over 300,000 people. That's a very successful community. So, a lot of things happened, some of them unpleasant, because there were a lot of groups living in this region, and some of them got along and some of them did not. But ultimately, around 1428, the people of Tenochtitlan joined with the people of some of the surrounding city-states of, let me get this right now, Texcoco and Tlacopan, and they formed an alliance, which means they agreed to work together. And this group became very strong. By joining forces, they became the strongest, basically the strongest army in the Valley of Mexico. And these three city-states built an empire. And so this is the point where we recognize the group that we now call the Aztecs. We call this the Aztec Empire. And when we say empire, what do we mean? From our other stories, does anybody have an idea of what it means to have an empire? Rashawn, is that your hand up? Nope. Okay. Nora.
It means that you have servants with slaves, and you're very powerful, and you have a humongous city and you rule over the city, kind of.
Okay. Okay.
And you a city that has inventions and that sort of stuff.
Okay.
It's much more powerful than everything else.
Thank you, Nora. So yeah, it essentially means, like Nora said, it means you are going out, you are conquering other areas, and you are taking those people and creating an environment where they are having to follow your rules. And sometimes this was done in a more benevolent fashion, meaning a kinder fashion, although it's never kind to go to a place and say, all of you folks, we're stronger than you, you now have to do what we say. That's not a kind act. But some of those groups that created empires over the years did it in a way that offered protection and support to those people. And other groups did it in a much harsher way that involved a lot of murder and, as Nora said, occasionally slavery, which means you don't even get to live your lives now. You're coming with us and you're going to work for us, and you abandon your homes and everything. So obviously that's terrible. But and I would say the Aztecs were capable of a lot of those acts all along that continuum. Some of the things that they did when they took over a place provided a lot of support to that area, encouraged the growth of farming, for example, encouraged the building of those causeways and brought water to people. But there were also some of the other unfortunate side effects of creating an empire, like murdering a lot of people, or putting people in a position where they had to fight for their homes, and even the women and children sometimes had to fight. So it was ugly. It was an ugly time. But their empire grew, and their soldiers crossed the mountains to the south and east. They were very strong and powerful if they were able to go across a mountain in order to continue conquering people and getting more land under their control.
Okay.
So,
Just need to know your.
What do you mean by murder?
Murder, killing people.
So
Yeah.
like the people they came to, or like?
Yeah, well, if they came to take over your land, usually what would happen is you would try to fight them. But they were bigger and stronger. And so in order to get control, they would kill a lot of people until they could just make the rest of the people do as they said. That's how they did it. It wasn't just the Aztecs, mind you. This is how empires were often built in those times. So from all the people that they conquered, the Aztecs demanded a tribute or a payment. And these tributes could be food, gems, precious minerals and metals, and clothing. They also could pay their tribute in corn, beans, different chilies, cotton, rubber, jaguar skins. Feathers of tropical birds were valuable, gold, silver, jade, and we know the most valuable, cacao beans, right? We know what those are used for.
Chocolate.
So the empire continued to grow, and by 1500, the Aztec Empire covered more than 200,000 square miles of Central America, and as many as 5 million people lived under their rule. From new people conquered, the Aztecs borrowed many ways of doing things. They learned from the Mayas. We talked about the Mayas.
Okay.
And the Mayas, of course, had learned from the Olmecs. And so over the course of these successive civilizations, we have some ideas that are growing and that are helping the Aztecs to build a strong empire. So, like the Mayas, the Aztecs had a calendar. They had a number system based on 20. And they had a system of writing. And just like the Maya, of course, they were building large cities. All the Aztec cities in the empire were ruled by one emperor, and the people believed that this emperor could speak to the gods. Below the emperor in society were nobles and soldiers, and then came farmers, artisans, and merchants. One thing that's very interesting about the Aztecs that was unusual for other civilizations at this time, Aztec women were permitted to own property and manage businesses. Now, I can tell you, at this same time over in Europe, that was not the case. So they appear to us now to be a little bit more advanced in this area. Women attended school, girls along with boys, and it was possible for a woman in the Aztec civilization to become a religious leader or a healer. And women could also own farms. At the very bottom of the Aztec society were slaves. Some Aztecs became slaves because their parents were too poor to support them. And others were forced into slavery because they had broken laws or were captured in battle. So they did own people and force them to work for them. Okay, I see a couple hands up. Adam, do you have another question, or was that from the previous question?
No, I didn't ask. I didn't raise my hand.
Okay, Alina.
I was wondering, so can the emperor try to conquer another? So can an emperor try to conquer another place with another emperor?
Yeah. They can try to take territory away from another empire, absolutely.
And I have a question.
Yeah.
Are there still empires today?
That's a great question. I want you to research that. That is an excellent question. Good girl. That is such a good question. Will you look into that, please, and let me know what you find?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Aztec religion. Just like many other ancient cultures, the Aztecs worshipped many gods. And one of the most important gods was Quetzalcoatl. I always have trouble with this one. Quetzalcoatl, who was the god of knowledge and creation. And the Aztecs believed that their world would end if they did not make sacrifices to their gods. So this is the tough part. Thousands of people died each year as human sacrifices. Because human sacrifice was so important to the Aztecs, their goal in any battle was to capture their enemies rather than kill them, so that they could become, they'd rather use the enemies to be the human sacrifices. So that was, you know, that was an important part of their religion, because they honestly believed if they did not do that, that the world would end. And so they felt as though they had no choice. Just checking for hands up. Okay.
How would they do the sacrifices?
That I did not include as part of this presentation. That's a little bit on the grisly side for our presentation today. But if you would like to research that, just have your mom and dad help.
I made a
Okay. The picture of this pyramid is from the ruins of a site called I have trouble with this one too. Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan. There we go, Mexico. And it was one of the once the largest city in Mesoamerica, but it was abandoned around 700 CE. When the Aztecs saw it, when the Aztecs saw it 600 years later, after it had been abandoned, they thought it had been a burial site of the gods. So the Aztecs were amazing engineers and architects, and we talked about their causeways, which were amazing, and they built something called a double aqueduct to bring fresh water into the city. And we will talk, when we're back at school, we will talk a little more about aqueducts. They're very, very interesting inventions. I would encourage you to research them if you are interested at all in the engineering side of how they brought water to their city. I would encourage that as a follow-up work. They built their floating gardens, chinampas. They built pyramids and temples. They made paper. Now, we've talked a lot about paper this year. Uh-oh, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, okay, sorry, Faith. I hope you come back. They made paper from the bark of wild trees, fig trees, and they wrote on the paper, and they had their writing system. It was, they attached their papers together and made kind of rudimentary books out of them. They did a great deal of writing, and they kept written records of their activities, their tributes, their taxes, and their maps. And every temple had a library of books about religion. The Aztecs were one of the first group of people to make it compulsory, which means mandatory. You have to go. They were one of the first groups of people to make everybody go to school. All the children, boys and girls, had to go to school, which is, we take for granted now that everyone will go to school. But they were one of the first to say, no, everyone in this society is going to go to school. Aztec medicine.
That's good.
Yeah, that was good. Aztec medicine used a variety of plants and herbs to treat illnesses, and they used the sap from certain plants to heal wounds and other injuries. And they performed surgery. Not sure I would like to experience Aztec surgery, but that they were doing that. And they had, as we talked about, a base 20 number system called the vigesimal, I don't know if that's spelled right, number system. The numbers 1 to 19 could be represented with your fingers, but to say number 20, you had to have a flag. 400 was a feather, and 8,000 was a bag that could hold 8,000 cacao beans. That's how important the cacao bean was. It was represented as a number in their number system.
Question,
Here is one of those books that they made by writing on that paper that they made from the fig tree. Aren't those beautiful?
They're really good pictures.
A variety of colored inks. Yeah, those are good pictures. And here's their number system. So these evidently represent the fingers, maybe. And then the flag. And then the bag of 8,000 cacao beans. Makes me giggle. Okay, the passion flower was a very important medicinal plant. And that's a picture of it. They used it for medicine.
Yucky.
Okay, well, it came to an end. By the early 1500s, they were ruling over many city-states, but a few places still remained independent of the Aztecs. And then we have, what else was happening right around the early 1500s? Say from 1492
Christopher Columbus.
early 1500s, what was happening?
Christopher Columbus.
Among others, yes. So we have our history books say discovery. We know obviously there were lots of people living here. So it wasn't exactly a discovery, except that it was the first time the people from Europe realized that all this was going on, right? So in the early 1500s, we have a lot of those European explorers heading this way, very excited to see what was all in this North American continent and what they could get their hands on. And so when the Spanish explorers discovered this area, they started to come over and they wanted to conquer it and make it part of the Spanish Empire. And so the independent city-states that were not really causing too much trouble for the Aztecs, they were just kind of around and they were independent. The Spanish created alliances with some of these independent groups. And so the Spanish conquistadors really appeared very strange to the Aztecs because they rode horses and they had steel weapons that were completely unknown to the Aztecs. And so they were a bit of a surprise. And they caught the Aztecs off guard, you could say. And so when the Aztecs saw them, they actually wondered if they were gods. Because according to their religion, they were expecting their gods to return to the Aztecs. And so when the conquistadors showed up, the Aztecs thought maybe these are the gods returning. And so they were easily tricked. And the Spanish were able to kind of confuse them and trick them into taking over. And they kidnapped their leader. They demanded that control of the city be handed over to them. And at this point, the Aztecs did fight back, but again, they were fighting against an enemy that had weapons and horses, which they were not used to. And so they were not prepared to deal with that kind of a battle. And so the city, the capital, finally fell to the Spanish. And the Spanish built a new city over the ruins of Tenochtitlan. And this new city became the center of Spain's new empire in the Americas. And today that is known as Mexico City. And there you have it. That is someone's painting of what happened. So you can see the warriors on their horses, and then you can see the Aztecs here defending their island city. Any questions? Okay. All right. That is just scratching the surface of what you could learn about the Aztecs. You could explore how chewing gum and chocolate were made and used by the Aztecs. You could investigate their ruler. The most common name for this ruler is Montezuma. I don't know how accurate or correct that is, but Ms. Searcy, when she wrote this up, she gave us 3 possibilities for you to look up. You could research the conquistadors and Hernando Cortez, their I guess, general. What were some of the other Aztec gods and goddesses? What were some of their tools and weaponry? You could investigate their clothing, jewelry, and art, and find out what other artists were inspired by Aztec art. The mural on the previous slide was painted by an artist that was influenced by Aztec art. You could find out who that was. What were the city-states that maintained their independence from the Aztecs? And you could explore the Nahuatl language, or like Alina, you could find out what other groups created empires. And are there any empires around today? Those are excellent questions. Okay, and that brings us to the end of our presentation. So, any questions?
No.
Nora. Sorry, Nora. There you go.
I don't have any questions.
Oh, I thought I saw your hand up. Sorry, kiddo. Adam.
How did the Spanish trick the Aztecs?
Well, I think they used the element of surprise, and they used their belief when the Aztecs saw them and thought maybe these are the gods that we've been waiting for. They used that to their advantage to take over. So, but by the time the Aztecs realized, oh no, these are just another warring, tribe coming to get us, it was too late for them to fight back. That would be something you could research, Adam. Find out a little more about that. There's a lot of books about the Aztecs out there. Okay. Any other questions before I let you go?
No.
Thank you all for coming this morning. And I will see you at Read Aloud. And then I will see you again at 2 o'clock. Don't forget for today. Okay?
Okay.
All right. A couple of you look like you might need a nap before Read Aloud. Okay, enjoy. I'll let you talk for a sec before I close down.
Bye. See you at
Bye.
Read.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye. Wow, there's not a lot of people.
Hi, Eleanor. Bye.
Okay, guys, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.